You can trade one life for five, death by trolley, and yet a majority of people say that it's okay in one case, and a majority of people tend to say that it's not okay in the other case.
This is the Discovery Files podcast from the U.S. National Science Foundation. I'm Nate Potker. There's been a lot of buzz around the show The Last of Us, and a major ethical question was raised in the finale when the protagonist had to make a choice: save his friend, or let them die to benefit the greater group. This problem has been used time and time again in films and television, and we wanted to investigate this phenomenon with an expert. We welcome back Joshua Greene, professor of psychology at Harvard University, who has spent a lot of time researching questions of morality. Professor Greene, thank you so much for joining us again.
Oh, my pleasure. Thanks for having me back.
The pretext for our conversation today really came from the season finale of a popular television series, which essentially boiled down to a trolley problem situation. Can you briefly explain the trolley problem?
Got it. So the trolley problem is a related set of philosophical dilemmas that has taken on a life of its own in research on human psychology and behavior. And in particular, this is in cognitive neuroscience and behavioral psychology research and more that are cross-cultural research and things like that. So the interesting thing about the trolley problem, philosophically speaking, is that it seems to kind of boil down to its essence what may be the biggest debate in modern moral philosophy, at least in the Western tradition. And that's the debate between these two different schools of thought known as consequentialism, or more specifically utilitarianism on one side, and deontology on the other. And consequentialism thinks of right and wrong primarily in terms of outcomes, in terms of costs and benefits. And deontology thinks of right and wrong primarily in terms of rules, in terms of rights, in terms of duty, sort of lines drawn in the sand that you must not cross or must cross, right? And with that in mind, we can trot out the examples that will certainly be familiar to many people. So in one version, which I'll call the switch case, a runaway trolley is headed towards five people, and the only way to save them is to turn it onto the side track, but there's one person there who's going to be killed if you do that. And there, most people say that it's okay to turn the trolley away from five, but onto one. In the most common contrast case, known as the footbridge case, you have a trolley that's headed towards five people, again, a runaway trolley going down the track. You are on a footbridge over the track in between the oncoming trolley and the five. And next to you is a person with a very big backpack. And the only way that you can save the five people is to push the person with the very big backpack off of the footbridge and onto the tracks, and essentially use that person as a trolley stopper. They'll stop the trolley, but that person will die, and it will save the five people. And we're making some assumptions here that you can't jump yourself because you're not wearing a giant backpack, so you wouldn't be big enough to stop the trolley. And we'll assume, yes, this will work and things like that. You've been to the movies, you know how to suspend disbelief. Those are the assumptions of the dilemma. And in that case, depending on where you go, but usually a majority of people say that it's wrong to push the guy off of the footbridge. And so here we have these two cases that are really very similar. You can trade one life for five, death by trolley, and yet a majority of people say that it's okay in one case, and a majority of people tend to say that it's not okay in the other case. And this is a really interesting scientific fruit fly, because here you have these, relatively minor differences, making a huge difference in what we think of as right or wrong. And these two cases seem to exemplify the strengths and weaknesses of these two major schools of philosophical thought. So the switch case, where most people say, yeah, it's okay to turn the trolley away from the five, even if you're going to end up killing the one person, that fits very well with the consequentialist or utilitarian perspective. Better to have five people alive and one person dead than the reverse, right? But the footbridge case really makes trouble there, because most people think that just seems wrong, even if we assume that you will save more lives by doing this. On the other hand, if someone is going to say, well, it's wrong to push the guy off the footbridge, then they have to explain, okay, but then why is it okay to turn the trolley in this case? What's the difference there, right? And so there's a longstanding philosophical debate about what the right moral principles are, using these kinds of competing intuitions or somewhat divergent intuitions as data points, right? And then I and other people, starting about 20 years ago, started using these as psychological probes, where we're looking at in people's brains when they're making these kinds of decisions and trying to understand, well, what in the brain is pushing one way on the one hand and the other way on the other hand, and what can this tell us about the organization of moral thinking or decision making more generally? And then other people have looked at patients with different kinds of brain damage and shown that different kinds of brain damage can have opposite effects on people's judgments on these cases. People with different types of conditions that don't have any kind of visible damage associated with them. People have done cross-cultural work on these things, looking around the world at what people have to say. And so we've learned a lot from these little sort of philosophical moral fruit flies.
You mentioned looking at how the brain is processing this. What is going on in the brain when they're making these kind of decisions? Are there certain areas where certain activity is happening?
Yeah. So what we've found, and it's consistent with a lot of other research, is that you've got sort of two different processing streams that are kind of meeting and then getting weighed against each other. So I think the experiment that I think makes this clearest is one that I did with Amitai Shenhav, who's now a professor at Brown University. And what we did was we had people respond to these moral dilemmas three different ways. So on the one hand, we might say, don't tell us what's right or wrong, just tell us which of these actions do you feel worse about, right? And by how much? And then in a different condition, we said, don't tell us what's right or wrong, just tell us which of these judgments best fits with the idea of promoting the greater good. Right? And then we said to them in the third condition, okay, give us an all things considered judgment. And what we found was that when we just asked people to report on which they feel worse about, you see increased activity in a part of the brain called the amygdala. And the amygdala it does a lot of different things, but in this context and many other contexts, it functions as a kind of emotional alarm system, right? So outside the moral domain, if you were about to touch something that had given you an electric shock in the past, right, your amygdala would be going, right? And in this context, when people think about pushing somebody off the footbridge or something like that, you see a response in the amygdala, and the strength of the amygdala response correlates with how bad they say they feel about it. So that is the kind of, that feels wrong, right? Then you have a different part of the brain. It's really a whole circuit, but the sort of, maybe the hub of it is in what's called the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. And this is a part of the brain that is involved in a lot of the kind of thinking that we think of as thinking. When you're remembering people used to remember phone numbers. When you're remembering a string of numbers for whatever purpose, so you now have to do that in 2023. Or if you have to exert a kind of control, inhibit a response, or apply a complicated rule, in decision making, the kind of stuff that feels like a mental effort, that is often the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, or in some cases, the ventrolateral prefrontal cortex. And what we see is that when people are just saying, okay, well, which is better in terms of cost and benefit, you see increased activity there. When you ask people to make an all things considered judgment, we see then increased activity in a part of the brain called the ventromedial prefrontal cortex. And we think of this as being kind of more on the emotional side of things. If you have damage to this region, the results are going to largely be about your not having emotional signals bear properly on the decisions that you're making, whether it's kind of gambling decisions or something like this in the moral domain. And what we see is, what it looks like is this is a region that takes factors that are, values that are represented elsewhere in the brain and puts them onto a kind of common playing field or platform and says, okay, all things considered, what feels like the right thing to do? So you kind of have this cost-benefit reasoning rule, this feeling that the action is just wrong, and then those things get weighed against each other to make an all things considered judgment.
Are there any inherent issues with the trolley problem itself?
Well, I think that, the number one people always say is, isn't this kind of unrealistic, right? And that's a very common reaction, particularly among researchers. It's actually just a little sort of anecdote and a little bit of whining. When I talk to basic scientists, they're the people who are most likely to say, isn't this kind of unrealistic? When I talk to people in business and law and medicine, they say, oh my goodness, this is what I deal with every day, right? This gets exactly to the essence of this, right? But I take the sort of scientific, criticism about ecological validity, as we call it, seriously. So the way I think of it is like this. There's a lot of research in basic science where we use weird things in order to laser in on cognitive processes that have wider application. So if you look at what a lot of vision scientists might use in their experiments, it's weird stuff. It's stuff like flashing checkerboards and these little turning Gabor patches, which are these little sine wave kind of, black and white things. If you look at people who study language, they'll often use weird sentences. The most famous weird sentence ever comes from Noam Chomsky, colorless green ideas sleep furiously. Not a typical thing that people say. But what's interesting about it is that it's useful for revealing the distinction between syntax and semantics. The sentence makes no sense semantically, but you can recognize exactly that it is a well-formed sentence, right? When it comes to these vision things, a lot of these things are very kind of high contrast, or they're going to dissociate different aspects of vision, right? You've got motion being processed over here, and you've got color being processed over there, right? I view trolley dilemmas. The idea is not that this is the most realistic thing that we could find to represent the kinds of moral decisions that people make. Instead, this is a really nice tool for showing that there's a distinction between certain kinds of processes, right? And those processes are the things that I described earlier, at least some of them, right? The feeling that an action is wrong, just with a gut feeling where you have to work to figure out why, but you just know that that just feels bad, right? And then an explicit conscious cost-benefit reasoning where you're saying, okay, well, this will cause these, this many lives to be saved and this many lives die, and overall that makes sense, right? And so it's really good for drawing those things out. And then if you're interested, for example, in studying individual differences, one of the recent advances in the field comes from a researcher named Paul Conway, who applied this earlier method that was used in memory research called process dissociation. And basically what he does, or what the method does, is you ask people a bunch of questions where you vary systematically the strength of the consequentialist argument, just how much better are the consequences or not, and how bad does this feel? You vary those things independently in a whole set of questions. And then you can say, for any given person who does the whole set, okay, to what extent do you feel, to what extent are you feeling that these things are just inherently wrong? And to what extent are your judgments following those consequences, right? And so now you can use this to predict things about individuals. Whereas if you just look at a plain old trolley case, for example, you don't know if someone says that it's okay to push the guy off the footbridge, you don't know if they're the kind of person who really cares about saving more lives or the kind of person who really doesn't care about pushing people off of high places, right? And so process dissociation is a nice job of separating those things out. So there are a lot of different, variations on this. But the basic idea is that these are neat little kind of probes that allow you to get something fundamental. And then you can see how those more fundamental things relate to neuroanatomy, how they relate to behavior in other contexts, how they relate to differences among individuals, and things like that.
Do you think it's because of that fundamental, almost archetypal nature of this sort of conflict that it's become so popular in movies and television? I read an article that had it at something like 17 out of 20 of the recent superhero movies used it at least once and sometimes multiple times.
Is that right? Is that an actual statistic, or is that? Oh my gosh, I didn't realize.
I mean, I don't know how scholarly the article was, but I did see an article breaking down how often these kind of problems are used in genre films.
Right. Wow, I didn't know. I mean, I knew it was out there. I didn't know it was that. Right. Well, I mean, conflict is the heart of drama, right? And in these cases, you can't imagine a more stark conflict, then, this life versus this life, and you have to choose, right? I mean, there's a natural sort of dramatic reason for using things like this. I think that the trolley dilemmas themselves have taken on a life of their own because it's a kind of experiment that you can run in your own head, right? So most psychology experiments, to understand the results, to see the results, you need statistics, right? You might have people making a certain kind of choice, and you say, okay, well, let's make people sad first. Let's make people happy first. Let's make them feel disgusted, and we'll see how that changes their behavior. And it's not going to be like an on-off switch. It's going to be something like, 60% of people make a choice in this condition, but 50% do it in this condition, and you can use statistics to sort of separate it out. What's cool about the trolley cases is that pretty much anyone can think about the switch case and go, to some extent, either they feel perfectly fine about it or they're somewhere in the middle. And whatever you're going to say about the switch case, you're almost certainly going to feel worse about the footbridge case. So wherever you are, you can just feel and see for yourself that gap. And I think that's part of why it's had such a life in science and beyond, is because you can really see the phenomenon in your own head and then wonder what is going on. And you can't just introspect it. You don't know. And I could tell you more about what we do know. So I've talked a bit about what's going on in the brain, but I haven't said something about, what actually is it about the footbridge case or the switch case that triggers different responses in the brain. So if you're interested, I can do.
Absolutely. And I think something else we had noted to ask you about might fit in there. Thinking about how if you know the person, it might impact your process.
Yeah. Well, I'm afraid my answers here are not surprising. If it's someone you care about, you're less likely to feel okay about killing them. And there may be more interesting variations on that. But that people have tried that kind of thing, and that's the main result, which is not surprising, but I think people bring this up often because it's such a big factor. And it's one of the things that seem to be missing when you just talk about this like an abstract stylized case without filling in those kinds of details. But the first thing people are going to want to know is, well, who is it, right? Of course, that certainly does matter. Yeah.
This question also has implications for programming self-driving or autonomous vehicles. Should they be programmed to hit fewer than more people? Should they protect you, or should they protect the people out on the road?
Right. So first, let me sort of note the sort of shift in the question there, because I think it's important. In the switch footbridge contrast, what you're really doing is, in both cases, it's this one person who's not you versus these 5 people who are not you, right? And there isn't really much of an analog of the footbridge case in an autonomous vehicle world. That is, you really have to work hard to come up with the idea that you're going to actively sacrifice one car to save another car full of more people or something like that. I mean, you could do it, but it's even within this realm where things are already a bit of a stretch, that's really a stretch. The more relevant issue is, as you said, about the person in the autonomous vehicle, person or people, and the people who might otherwise be out there. So a kind of version of this would be there are a bunch of people in the road who shouldn't be there, but maybe it's their fault, maybe it's not. They're there, and the autonomous vehicle, let's say it's a narrow road, high speed. The autonomous vehicle can swerve out of the way to avoid hitting those 5 people, but you're going to swerve into the wall and you're going to kill whoever's in the car, right? So in a sense, from the point of view of the car, it actually is a kind of trolley problem. It's just one's inside and the other one's outside, right? And this is interesting. I mean, people have very mixed views about this. On the one hand, I think, people like the idea of saving more lives. And if there really was a situation like this, a lot of people would say that would make sense. On the other hand, people really don't like the idea that their car would choose to kill them, the car that they're in, right? And so, Iyad Rawan and Azim Sharif and Jean-Francois Bonnefond ran a now classic study where they used these kinds of dilemmas, and they found that there are people, there a real sort of mix of views about these things, and so that's interesting. I can tell you a little bit about the one paper that I've published on this. This is with Karen Huang and Max Bazerman. We did a study where we applied an idea called veil of ignorance reasoning. So this goes back to the famed philosopher John Rawls, and also at the same time an economist philosopher, John Farsanyi, who independently came up with the idea of the veil of ignorance as a kind of thought experiment for making good decisions or just decisions. In Rawls's case, and he's the one who's sort of more famously associated with this idea, Rawls was interested in what does a just society look like? And his thought was, well, a just society is one that you would choose to live in if you didn't know who in it you were going to be. Right? So societies might have people who are rich, people who are poor, men, women, religious, not religious, different races, all of those things. If you didn't know, you wouldn't want to live in a society that oppresses religious people if you didn't know whether or not you're going to be religious. And I should say an important feature of this is the decision is purely self-interested, but in ignorance of where you are. And so the idea is it's related to morality, even though it's a selfish decision. But the idea is that the impartiality, instead of saying make a moral decision, be impartial, what it says is make a selfish decision under the assumption that you have an equal chance, roughly, there's a little asterisk past that, which I won't get into, of being anyone in this society, right? Another way of thinking about it is it's a little bit like the I cut, you choose method of splitting a cake, where it's a method that allows two people who are fundamentally selfish to arrive at a fair outcome, where the procedure creates the fairness, right? So in the same way, a selfish person who doesn't know who they're going to be has to choose what the rules of society look like. Right? Now, Rawls famously thought that you would not want to choose a society that's utilitarian or consequential, one that produces the greatest amount of good overall, because he was worried about, but still you could have kind of unfair inequality and people wouldn't choose them. I and other people have had arguments against this, that Rawls is sort of misunderstanding well-being for wealth and things like that. I don't want to go too far of field with that. But what we did in these experiments with trolley dilemmas and other things is we took this method that Rawls applied to the overall structure of society and applied it to these trolley cases. So we did it with the footbridge case, where we said, there are 6 people whose lives are at stake, the 1 person on the footbridge and the 5 people on the track. Suppose you had a 1 in 6 chance of being each of these people, right? Which means that you have a 5 in 6 chance of being on the tracks and a 1 in 6 chance of being the person on the footbridge. Now, from a purely self-interested perspective, what would you want the decision maker to do? And let me do the math for you in case you're not keeping up. If the decision maker pushes, then you have a 1 in 6 chance of dying and a 5 in 6 chance of living, right? If the decision maker doesn't push, then you have a 5 out of 6 chance of dying and a 1 in 6 chance of living. What would you want the decision maker to do from a purely self-interested perspective? Most people say, well, I like having much higher odds of living, so I would choose that. Now, that's a different question, but a very different answer from what you get in the typical footbridge case, right? Now, Rawls's idea is he's interested in the real world. What really out there for real would be a just society. But his thought experiment says what you should say about the real world as a moral person is what a selfish person would say about this hypothetical question where you don't know who you're going to be, right? And in this, and so we essentially had people go through that exercise where it's a different question, but it's related, right? Because it's capturing this idea of impartiality. And what we found is that when people went through this exercise of thinking, oh yeah, I guess if I didn't know who I was going to be, I would want the person to push, right? After they went through that exercise, then they were then more likely to say that it's okay to push the guy off the footbridge as a kind of moral judgment, which is maybe not a conclusion that Rawls would like, although it's not strictly incompatible with his philosophy answering different questions. We did this with the self-driving car case. And this is where I think in one of our experiments, we really got the biggest effect. That is, people were pretty lukewarm about having, you just asked them, would you want the car to swerve? Right? People were, I don't know how I feel about that. But if you didn't know who you were going to be, and we did it by the numbers, there's one person in the car and 9 people, it's all dialed up in that way. I think in one of our studies, like 85% of people said that they would, that if they didn't know who they were going to be, they wouldn't want the car to swerve. 90% chance of living. And we did this with biomedical cases as well. Oxygen for surgeries after an earthquake was one of our things. And across all these cases, what we found is that going through this veil of ignorance exercise makes people more likely to give the utilitarian response. Now, does that mean it's the right response? That's a better response. That's opening a whole can of worms, but it's interesting that if you get people to engage in this kind of reasoning, it changes what they think in a specific direction. And this seems to apply to things that are more realistic and relevant, like biomedical cases, and things that, engineers of autonomous vehicles really need to think about, as well as the good old trolley and fruit fly case.
One last question we have for you as we wrap things up today. Can a better understanding of morality help us solve the problems that divide us?
Absolutely. And this is a lot of what I'm actually working on now. So I'll give you some. I moved more towards kind of applied work. I did an earlier podcast with you and Abigail Marsh where we talked about giving multiplier. And our goal with that was to get, to make people consider supporting charities that are much more effective than typical charities, right? So, you can provide a deworming treatment. That is a treatment that gets rid of intestinal worms for someone for less than $1. That's a very, very good moral deal, right? But most people don't think about that, and they're much more likely to donate money to something local where it could be, you get 100 or 1,000 times less value out of that in terms of preventing human suffering from doing that. But most people, they want to support the things that are most personally meaningful to them. So we created this website that says, hey, why don't you do both? You'll give some of your money to charity that you picked, some of your money to a super duper effective charity like the deworming charity, and to sweeten the deal, we'll add money on top. And then we also ask people, hey, you just got this money added on top. Do you want to support the matching fund and kind of pay it forward? And some people do that. And the long and short of this is we've raised about $2.4 million with this website, and close to $1.5 million of it has gone to these super duper effective charities. Our estimates are that we've saved dozens of lives as a result of directing money to incredibly highly effective charities. This is using the same dual process idea, right? But it's the opposite of a moral dilemma. In the moral dilemma, we are making you make that uncomfortable choice that you don't want to make between the heart and the head, if you want to call it that. Right? There are some fine-grained distinctions here, which I won't get into. Here we're saying, you can get out of the dilemma, right? You didn't even know this was a dilemma, and we're going to let you get out of it, right? By saying, here, do a little heart, give to the charity you love, but also do something super effective, right? So this is taking that exact insight and applying it in a way that can do a lot of good. And other projects in the work that are, again, trying to figure out how do you produce an outcome that makes more sense in terms of producing good consequences, but speaks to people's emotional concerns in a way that allows them to feel comfortable doing something that is ultimately going to be better for the world.
Special thanks to Joshua Greene. For the Discovery Files, I'm Nate Potker. You can watch an expanded version of this conversation on our YouTube channel by searching @NSF Science. Please subscribe wherever you get podcasts, and if you like our program, share with a friend and consider leaving a review. Discover how the U.S. National Science Foundation is advancing research at nsf.gov.